The steel was cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the warm afternoon sun. The cold metallic click of the handcuffs locking around Chanel Brooks's wrists echoed in the sudden quiet of the park, a sound of finality that sent a tremor of shock through her. Her expression was one of stunned disbelief, not of guilt. Two police officers, their faces grim and set like stone, were pulling her up from a park bench with impersonal force. Her sketchbook and a fan of expensive graphite pencils lay scattered on the dusty ground, the intricate architectural drawings of a brighter future fluttering in the indifferent breeze. Just beyond the officer's shoulders, a news camera was visible, its red recording light a glaring, unblinking eye, capturing every second of her humiliation. All of this for a dream? The thought, sharp and painful, pierced through her shock. She was a dreamer, a builder, a woman who saw a brighter future in the heart of her city. She never imagined her vision would lead to this, to being treated like a criminal in the very place she was trying to save. She didn't know that the person who made the call was watching from a nearby window with a smug smile, or that this moment of humiliation would ignite a firestorm across the city. As the officers led her away, one question hung in the air. Could this injustice be the spark that finally brings a broken community together? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Earlier that day, Redwood Park had been a canvas for Chanel's vision, a place of forgotten potential basking under a warm autumn sun. The park was a portrait of neglect. The grass grew in sad, patchy clumps, interspersed with stretches of bare, sun-baked earth. The playground equipment, a relic from a more optimistic time, was a skeleton of rusted metal, its swings missing, its slide a faded streak of melancholy blue. A sense of abandonment hung in the air, a quiet testament to years of budget cuts and civic indifference. Yet, Chanel saw something else entirely. She saw not what it was, but what it could be. She sat on a worn-down bench, its wooden slats bleached gray by the elements and etched with the graffiti of countless bored teenagers. Dressed in tailored black trousers and a simple but elegant silk blouse, with comfortable flats that spoke of a woman who was used to being on her feet, she was an island of focused purpose in a sea of decay. Chanel Brooks, in her late 30s, was the city's parks commissioner, a title she had earned through 2 decades of relentless community advocacy and a passion that burned as brightly as the sun overhead. She had clawed her way up from the very neighborhoods she now served, her success a defiant answer to the low expectations that had surrounded her youth. Her sketchbook, a large, professional-grade portfolio, was open on her lap. She was not doodling. Her hand moved with the precise, confident strokes of an architect, her brow furrowed in concentration. These were plans, meticulous and lovingly detailed, for the new Redwood Park Youth Center. She sketched a wall of glass that would flood the interior with natural light, making the space feel open and welcoming, not institutional. She drew a library, its shelves filled with books, with cozy reading nooks where a child could get lost in a story. She envisioned a gleaming basketball court, the sound of sneakers squeaking on polished wood, replacing the current silence. A state-of-the-art computer lab took shape under her pencil, a place where kids could learn to code, to design, to connect with a world beyond their immediate circumstances. Her passion was evident in every line, in the intensity of her focus, in the way she would occasionally pause, her gaze lifting to the empty space before her, as if she could already see the finished building standing there, vibrant and full of life. This was more than a job for her. It was a calling. A deep, resonant wave of nostalgia washed over her as she worked. She remembered playing in this very park as a child. Back then, it had been the beating heart of the neighborhood. The swings were always full, the air thick with the sound of children's laughter and the rhythmic thump of a kickball. It was where friendships were forged, where scraped knees were a badge of honor, and where the entire community gathered on long summer evenings. That sense of community had eroded over the years, chipped away by neglect until only a ghost of it remained. Chanel's motivation was profoundly personal. She wanted to restore that feeling, to build a sanctuary for the next generation, especially for the kids from underprivileged backgrounds who, like her, had grown up with nowhere else to go. She felt a spiritual connection to this space, a conviction that healing the park was the first step toward healing the community. The scent of damp earth and the distant, humming drone of city traffic filled her senses. A lone bird sang a hopeful melody from a nearby oak tree, a counterpoint to the rhythmic, satisfying scrape of her pencil on the textured paper. From a distant, better-maintained section of the park, the faint, joyful laughter of children drifted on the breeze, a reminder of what was possible, of what she was fighting for. From her window in a pristine, expensive apartment building that loomed over the park, Agnes Petrov saw none of this. Her world was one of polished surfaces, quiet hallways, and the hushed, sterile atmosphere of carefully curated wealth. She had lived in the building for decades, a silent sentinel watching the neighborhood change around her, and she did not approve of the direction it was heading. Agnes valued order and quiet above all else. But her definition of order was narrow and brittle, tinged with a deep-seated prejudice that she mistook for discernment. To her, the park's neglect was not a failure of civic policy but a symptom of moral decay, a direct result of the loiterers and undesirables she believed were drawn to it. She raised a pair of powerful binoculars to her eyes, the lenses sweeping across the park with practiced vigilance. Her gaze passed over a young mother pushing a stroller, a man walking his dog, and then settled, with a sharp, focused intensity, on Chanel. Agnes did not see a professional woman at work. She did not see the stylish clothes, the expensive sketchbook, or the focused passion. She saw a black woman, sitting alone on a park bench for an extended period. In Agnes's mind, this image fit neatly into a pre-written narrative of vagrancy, of someone who was up to no good, a potential threat to the carefully constructed peace of her residential enclave. Her lips, thin and pale, pursed in a tight knot of disapproval. This was exactly the kind of activity that brought property values down. She lowered the binoculars and picked up her cordless phone from its cradle. With a decisive jab of her finger, she dialed the police non-emergency line, her heart beating with a small, satisfying flutter of civic duty. "Yes, I'd like to report a loiterer in Redwood Park," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "A woman. She's been there for over an hour, just sitting there. It looks suspicious. This is a residential area, you know. We pay high taxes to feel safe." She listened for a moment, then added, "Yes, right on the bench facing the old playground. You can't miss her." She hung up the phone, a smug sense of accomplishment settling over her. She had done her part. She had maintained order. She returned to her window, binoculars in hand, to watch the authorities handle the problem she had so helpfully identified. The patrol car, a standard black and white, pulled up to the curb with a quiet crunch of tires on gravel. The doors opened and 2 officers emerged, their blue uniforms a stark, official presence against the park's muted colors. Officer Davis, the senior partner, stepped out first. He was a man in his late 50s, with a weary slump to his shoulders and a cynical expression etched into the lines around his eyes. He had been a cop for 30 years, and the city had worn him down, leaving him with a deep-seated weariness and a hardened skepticism of the public he was sworn to protect. He saw most calls not as opportunities to help, but as thankless chores, another pointless chapter in a never-ending story of human folly. His partner, Officer Wright, was younger, barely 30, with a ramrod-straight posture and an earnest, eager-to-please look on his face. He still believed he could make a difference, that the uniform meant something noble, but years of partnering with Davis had taught him to defer to the older man's judgment, to swallow his own instincts in favor of his partner's jaded experience. They approached Chanel cautiously, their boots making soft thuds on the dry grass. Davis took the lead, his body language immediately confrontational. His hand rested near his service weapon, a gesture that was more habit than threat, but a signal of authority nonetheless. Wright hung back slightly, his role that of observer and backup, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Ma'am, we've had a complaint about you loitering," Davis said, his voice a flat, gravelly monotone that carried no hint of inquiry, only accusation. Chanel looked up, her concentration broken. She blinked, surprised by the sudden appearance of the 2 officers. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, but she remained calm, her expression open and questioning. "Loitering?" she repeated, her voice even. "Officer, I'm working." She gestured with her pencil toward the sketchbook in her lap, assuming a simple explanation would suffice. Davis's eyes flickered down to the sketchbook and then back to her face, his expression thick with skepticism. He saw only lines on a page, not a blueprint for a community's future. Working on what? He scoffed, a dismissive edge to his tone. "This is a public park, not an office. You're going to have to move along." The words, and the casual disdain with which they were delivered, struck Chanel with a familiar, painful sting. It was the sting of being misjudged, of being summarily dismissed based on a preconceived notion of who she was and where she belonged. It was a frustration she had dealt with her entire life, a constant, low-grade battle against assumptions and stereotypes. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing herself to remain composed, to not let the anger that simmered just below the surface boil over. She still believed, perhaps naively, that reason could prevail, that a simple explanation would clear up this absurd misunderstanding. But the officers, particularly Davis, saw only defiance in her composure. They saw a woman who was not immediately complying, who was questioning their authority. In that moment, the gap between a misunderstanding and a confrontation narrowed to a razor's edge, and the tension in the quiet park began to escalate, charged with the weight of unspoken biases and the looming shadow of a terrible mistake. Chanel held her ground, her feet planted firmly on the soil of the park she was determined to save. She refused to be intimidated, to be chased away like some unwanted stray. She met Officer Davis's dismissive gaze with a steady one of her own, her chin held high. "I assure you, I have a right to be here," she stated, her voice a calm, clear counterpoint to his gruffness. She gestured again to her sketchbook, to the tangible proof of her purpose. "I'm actually planning a new development for this very spot." Officer Davis let out a short, sharp sound, a scoff that was pure, undiluted contempt. "A development?" he echoed, drawing the word out as if it were a foreign, ridiculous concept. His eyes, clouded with years of cynicism, saw not a visionary but a nuisance. "Ma'am, I've heard it all. I've given you a lawful order to leave the park." His partner, Officer Wright, shifted his weight, a flicker of unease crossing his younger face. He glanced from his partner's rigid posture to the woman's composed demeanor, a silent question hanging in the air between them. A fire ignited in Chanel's chest, hot and swift. It was the righteous anger of a person who had spent a lifetime justifying her own existence. She had fought for her education, for her seat at the table, for the right to be heard in rooms filled with men who looked right through her. She would not be dismissed by a beat cop in a park she was legally and morally responsible for. She rose slowly from the bench, a deliberate, fluid motion of contained power. Her voice, when she spoke, was firm, not aggressive, but it carried the undeniable weight of authority. "And I am telling you," she said, her eyes locked on Davis, "that order is based on a false premise. I am not loitering. I am the parks commissioner for this city." The statement hung in the air for a beat, pregnant with significance. It was the truth, a simple, verifiable fact. But to Officer Davis, it sounded like a challenge, a desperate, outlandish lie designed to undermine his authority. He had dealt with 1,000 people like her, people who claimed to know the mayor, who threatened to have his badge. His patience, already worn thin by the long, hot day and a career of thankless encounters, finally snapped. A dark flush crept up his neck. "The parks commissioner," he spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Right, and I'm the mayor." He took a decisive step forward, his face a mask of grim determination. "You're coming with us." Before Chanel could process the words, his hand shot out and grabbed her arm just above the elbow. His grip was hard, unyielding. The sudden, unwanted physical contact sent a jolt through her system. It was a violation, an escalation that was both shocking and terrifyingly predictable. On pure instinct, a reflex born of self-preservation, she pulled her arm back. It was not a violent act, not a struggle, but a natural, human reaction to being seized without consent. For Officer Davis, however, this minor physical resistance was all the justification he needed. It was the final piece of the puzzle he had already assembled in his mind. "That's it," he barked, his voice tight with adrenaline. "You're resisting arrest." Chanel's calm finally shattered, replaced by a tidal wave of shock and a surge of pure, cold adrenaline. The situation was spiraling, tumbling out of control with a terrifying momentum. "Resisting?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not resisting." But her words were lost in the sudden, brutal efficiency of the arrest. Davis twisted her arm behind her back with practiced force. Officer Wright, his earlier hesitation dissolving in the face of his partner's decisive action, moved in to assist, his face a blank mask of professional duty. He took her other arm, his touch more hesitant but just as firm. Chanel felt a terrifying sense of powerlessness, a feeling she hadn't experienced since she was a child, small and unheard. They forced her hands together behind her back, and the world seemed to narrow to the single, brutal sensation of the cold metal of the handcuffs closing around her wrists. The double click was a sound of absolute finality, a punctuation mark on a sentence she never thought she would be a part of. The walk to the patrol car was a blur of shame and disbelief. The officers, one on each side, paraded her across the patchy grass, as if she were a dangerous criminal, a trophy of their vigilance. The world, which had been a quiet canvas for her dreams only moments before, had transformed into a hostile, jeering arena. People were starting to notice. A man walking his dog stopped and stared, his mouth slightly agape. A group of teenagers on the far side of the park, who had been laughing and kicking a soccer ball, fell silent, their eyes wide, and then came the phones. One by one, they were pulled from pockets, their dark screens held up like weapons, their lenses trained on her. The whirring and clicking of their digital shutters was a new kind of assault, 1,000 tiny judgments being recorded for posterity. Chanel's face burned with a humiliation so profound it felt like a physical blow. She tried to keep her head held high, to project an image of dignity she did not feel, but her mind was a chaotic storm of racing thoughts. She thought of the children she was trying to build this center for, the ones who already felt like the world was against them. What would they think if they saw her like this, cuffed and shamed in the very place she had promised to transform for them? This was no longer just an unjust arrest, it was a public relations nightmare, a potential death blow to the project that had become her life's work. Who would believe in her vision now? How could she stand before the city council and ask for their support when she had been arrested for loitering in one of her own parks? Her credibility, so painstakingly built over years of hard work, felt as fragile as the scattered pages of her sketchbook, liable to be torn apart by the slightest gust of public opinion. Just as the officers reached the rear door of their patrol car, a new sound cut through the murmuring of the small crowd. It was the high-pitched screech of tires, followed by the slamming of doors. A white van with a local news station's logo emblazoned on its side had screeched to a halt at the curb. A reporter, a woman with sharp eyes and a microphone already in hand, jumped out, followed closely by a cameraman who hoisted a large camera onto his shoulder. The red light was already on. The reporter began shouting questions, her voice sharp and insistent. "Ma'am, what's your name? Why are you being arrested?" The camera zoomed in, and Chanel felt its intrusive gaze like a physical touch, stripping her bare before the entire city. Just then, a new voice, high-pitched and frantic, cut through the chaos. "Stop! What are you doing? Let her go!" A young woman was pushing her way through the small crowd of onlookers, her face a mask of pure panic. It was Maria, Chanel's assistant, a whirlwind of youthful energy and fierce, unwavering loyalty. She had been scheduled to meet Chanel here with a stack of survey documents and zoning permits. In her haste, her arms laden with files, the scene of her boss being forced into a police car had been too much to process. The files slipped from her grasp, the carefully organized papers scattering across the ground, a flurry of white that mirrored the chaos in her mind. She didn't even notice. Her eyes were fixed on the officers, her expression a mixture of terror and outrage. Officer Wright, startled by the new arrival, turned to intercept her. He put up a hand, his voice taking on the strained tone of an official trying to maintain control of a scene that was rapidly deteriorating. "Ma'am, step back. This is police business." His words were a wall, but Maria crashed right through them, her voice rising with desperation. She pointed a trembling finger at the back of the patrol car, where Chanel was now half-seated, her face hidden from view. "You don't understand," Maria cried, her voice cracking. "That's Commissioner Brooks. She's the park's commissioner." The words, shouted with such desperate conviction, had an immediate, seismic effect. The officers froze, the reporter's jaw dropped, the small crowd gasped, a collective sound of astonishment. Officer Davis, who had been pushing Chanel into the car, slowly straightened up. He turned, his face a canvas of confusion, and looked at the hysterical young woman. He then turned his gaze back to the patrol car, as if seeing the woman inside for the first time. Finally, his eyes darted to the news camera, which was now pointed directly at his face, capturing the precise moment his entire world tilted on its axis. The reporter, recovering from her shock, smelled blood in the water. Her eyes, which had been merely curious, now gleamed with the thrill of a major story breaking right in front of her. A sudden, dead silence fell over the scene, so profound it felt as if the entire park was holding its breath. The only sound was the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the news camera. The expressions on the officers' faces shifted in a slow, horrifying sequence. The mask of detached authority dissolved, replaced first by sheer, uncomprehending disbelief, then by the dawning, sickening horror of realization. Officer Davis's ruddy complexion went pale, the blood draining from his face until he was the color of ash. He looked as if he had been punched in the gut. Officer Wright, standing beside him, looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and a deep, gut-wrenching shame. The reporter was the first to break the spell. She lunged forward, thrusting her microphone toward the stunned officers. "Officer, is it true?" she shouted, her voice ringing out in the silence. "Have you just arrested the park's commissioner?" Davis opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. She, he finally stammered, his voice a hoarse croak. She She didn't identify herself. From the back of the patrol car, a voice cut through the chaos. It was calm, measured, and carried an unmistakable authority that sliced through the tension like a knife. Chanel leaned forward, her face coming into view, her expression unreadable but her eyes burning with a cold, quiet fire. "I did, officer," she said, her voice clear and steady, for all the world to hear. "You just didn't believe me." The power dynamic, which had been so brutally one-sided, inverted in that single stunning moment. The officers, who had held all the power, were now the ones who were trapped, exposed, and utterly humiliated, their mistake broadcast live for the entire city to see. Chanel, despite the cold steel still binding her wrists, had regained complete control of the situation. In her eyes, there was no gloating, no overt sign of victory. There was only a moment of quiet, steely triumph, mixed with the deep, lingering pain of an ordeal that had cost her dearly, but had also, in a way she was only just beginning to understand, given her a weapon she never knew she had. The air in the precinct supervisor's office was sterile and cold, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the heated emotions of the past hour. The handcuffs were gone, but a phantom pressure still lingered on Chanel's wrists, a ghostly reminder of the cold steel. She sat in a stiff, uncomfortable chair, the plastic digging into her back, while a man who radiated panic like a heat wave paced in front of her. This was Captain Wallace, the police chief, a man whose face, currently a mask of frantic damage control, was familiar from a dozen city functions. He was sweating, a fine sheen of perspiration glistening on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his apologies were a torrent, a river of placating words that felt as hollow as a drum. In the corner of the room, standing shoulder to shoulder like statues of shame, were Officers Davis and Wright. They were silent and pale, their gazes fixed on a nondescript patch of wall, their bodies rigid with the effort of avoiding eye contact with the woman they had arrested. Maria had procured a bottle of water from a vending machine, and Chanel held it, the cool plastic a small solid comfort in her hands. She took a slow, deliberate sip, the silence amplifying the sound, and then she set the bottle down on the metal desk between them with a soft click. Captain Wallace paused his pacing, taking her action as an invitation to speak again. "Commissioner Brooks," he began, his voice thick with a forced sincerity, "on behalf of the entire department, I am so sorry. This is an unacceptable, colossal failure on our part. I want to assure you there will be a full, thorough, and transparent investigation. The officers involved will be held accountable. This is not what we stand for." Chanel let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing his words to hang in the sterile air and evaporate. She looked at him, her gaze level and unflinching, and for the first time, the captain met her eyes and had the decency to look away. "An investigation is a start, Captain," she said, her voice calm and collected, yet carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller. "But this isn't about a failure. This is about a culture. This isn't about two officers having a bad day. It's about a system that allowed them to see a black woman sitting in a park and immediately assume the worst." She leaned forward slightly, her quiet intensity drawing all the energy in the room toward her. "What if I hadn't been a commissioner? What if I was just Jane Doe from the neighborhood, a mother waiting for her child, a student studying for an exam? Would she be sitting in your office right now? Would she be getting this apology from the chief of police himself? Or would she be in a holding cell, trying to figure out how to make bail? Her life upended by a colossal failure that no one in a position of power would ever have to answer for." Her questions were not accusations, they were scalpels, cutting through his superficial apologies to expose the deeper disease. She wasn't asking for her own sake. She was demanding an answer for all the women who didn't have her title, who didn't have her voice. Captain Wallace opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no answer, and they both knew it. Chanel had refused to let this be swept under the rug as a simple, unfortunate mistake. She had framed it as what it was, a symptom of a systemic issue, shifting the focus from her personal grievance to a much larger, more painful community problem. Miles away, in a sleek, modern office on the top floor of a city hall annex, Councilman Roberts watched the drama unfold on a massive, wall-mounted screen. The news channel was playing the footage on a loop, the reporter's breathless voice narrating the shocking arrest of a city official. Roberts, a man whose ambition was as sharp and tailored as his expensive suit, leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. He saw not a crisis, but an opportunity. Chanel Brooks and her community-focused projects, her constant appeals to the city's conscience, were a thorn in his side. He saw her as a bleeding-heart idealist, a political rival whose agenda was a drain on city funds that could be better used to support business interests. His interests. He saw her as an obstacle, and now, that obstacle had stumbled. He picked up his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he dialed a familiar number. "It's a mess," he said into the phone, his voice smooth as silk, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the news report. He swiveled his chair to look out the panoramic window at the sprawling city below. "But we can spin it. Listen to me. Frame it as a distraction. She's grandstanding, using this unfortunate incident to push her pet project. The police were just doing their jobs, responding to a citizen's complaint. It's a classic case of overreaction on her part." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "Exactly. We need to control the narrative before she turns herself into some kind of martyr. Get our people on the talk shows. Emphasize officers' safety, the difficulty of their jobs. We'll paint her as the aggressor, the one who escalated the situation. By the time she knows what's happening, this won't be about police reform. It'll be about her fitness for office." He ended the call and immediately made another, then another. The battle was no longer just about a wrongful arrest. It was about the future of the Redwood Park Youth Center, and Councilman Roberts was mobilizing his army to ensure it was dead on arrival. That evening, the public mask of the calm, collected commissioner finally came off. In the quiet sanctuary of her home, a comfortable, tastefully decorated brownstone filled with books and art, the day's events came crashing down on her. She was sitting on her plush sofa, wrapped in a thick, soft blanket as if to ward off a sudden, deep-seated chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The sketchbook, which Maria had dutifully retrieved from the park, lay on the coffee table, its cover closed. It was a painful reminder of the dream that had led to the nightmare. She wasn't talking, just staring into the middle distance, her eyes unfocused, replaying the clicks of the handcuffs, the flash of the cameras, the burning sting of humiliation. Her father, a retired judge named William, a man whose wisdom was as profound as his love for his daughter, sat in the armchair opposite her. He didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes or easy comforts. He simply sat with her, his presence a silent, solid anchor in the storm of her emotions. For the first time since the patrol car had pulled up, Chanel allowed herself to feel the full, unvarnished truth of her own vulnerability. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The anger was a hot, bitter bile rising in her throat, and beneath it all, a cold, creeping tendril of fear. She questioned herself, her mind turning on a torturous loop. Had she handled it wrong? Should she have just packed up her things and left the park as soon as they asked? Would that have been the smarter play, the path of least resistance? The thought was a betrayal of everything she believed in, but in the safety of her own home, the doubt was a corrosive acid. But then, just as quickly, the anger returned, burning away the fear and the self-recrimination. It was a righteous, clarifying fire. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had a right to be there. This happened for a reason. She couldn't let it be for nothing. She couldn't let them win. Not Davis, not the faceless woman who made the call, and certainly not the political vultures like Roberts who were already circling. Her father seemed to sense the shift in her. The moment the embers of her spirit reignited, he leaned forward, his kind, intelligent eyes meeting hers. "They didn't just arrest a commissioner today, Chanel," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "They arrested a symbol. The question is, what will that symbol stand for tomorrow?" Chanel looked up, the fog of her despair finally lifting. Her father's words were a key, unlocking the resolve that had been momentarily trapped by the trauma of the day. She looked at her hands, no longer seeing the phantom marks of the cuffs, but seeing their potential, their ability to build. Her eyes, when she met her father's gaze again, were filled with a new, unshakable fire. "It will stand for change," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the clarity of a bell. "It has to." The battle had been joined, and Chanel Brooks was ready to fight. The morning after the arrest, the sky over City Hall was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a serene canopy over the brewing storm on the ground. The steps were a chaotic forest of microphones, tripods, and cameras, a tangled thicket of technology aimed at a single wooden podium. Reporters jostled for position, shouting questions at anyone who looked remotely official. The air crackled with anticipation. Then a door opened and a hush fell over the crowd. Chanel Brooks stepped out into the sunlight, flanked by Maria on one side, and her stoic, silver-haired legal counsel on the other. She was the eye of the hurricane, an island of profound calm in the swirling chaos. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress, her posture impeccable, her expression poised and powerful. In the crowd, she spotted Councilman Roberts, standing near a stone pillar, his arms crossed, a sour, watchful expression on his face. He looked like a man who had come to see a public execution, only to find the condemned was running the event. Chanel walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and let her gaze sweep across the sea of faces and lenses. She didn't wait for the shouting to resume. She began to speak, her voice clear and steady, amplified by the sound system to carry across the entire plaza. "Yesterday," she began, "I went to Redwood Park to work. I went there to continue designing a place of hope and opportunity for our city's children. Instead, I was arrested for dreaming. I was arrested for daring to exist in a public space while black." A wave of murmurs rippled through the press corps. Cameras flashed with renewed intensity. Chanel paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "This incident, however, is not about me," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "My title, my position, ultimately protected me. This is a symptom of a much deeper issue. It is about who we, as a city, believe belongs in our public spaces and who we instinctively see as a threat. It is about the silent, corrosive biases that lead to assumptions, and the assumptions that lead to injustice. The question we must ask ourselves is not why a city commissioner was arrested, but how many of our citizens are subjected to the same humiliation without the benefit of a title to save them." She saw Roberts shift his weight, his jaw tightening. She had taken his narrative, the one he had been carefully crafting about her supposed grandstanding, and turned it into a mirror, forcing the entire city to look at its own reflection. "I have been asked if I want the officers involved to be fired. I have been asked if I intend to sue the city. My answer is no. I do not want revenge. I want reform. I do not want punishment. I want partnership." She leaned forward, her knuckles white on the sides of the podium, her voice ringing with passion. "We cannot build a better future on a foundation of anger and division. We must build it with our own two hands, together. That is why today I am announcing that the Redwood Park Youth Center project is being fast-tracked. The ground-breaking ceremony will not be in 6 months or next year. It will be next week." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was the countermove no one, especially not Roberts, had anticipated. "This center," Chanel declared, her voice soaring, "will be a place where every child, regardless of their background, their zip code, or the color of their skin, feels safe, valued, and seen. It will be a testament to the idea that our public spaces are for everyone. It will be a bridge between our communities and our police, a place for dialogue and understanding, not suspicion and fear. We will turn a site of injustice into a beacon of hope. The work begins now." She stepped back from the podium, her statement complete. The reporters erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions, but she simply nodded, turned, and walked back into City Hall, leaving a political firestorm in her wake. Roberts, momentarily forgotten by the swarm of reporters now focused on the breaking news of the accelerated project, looked as though he had just swallowed poison. He had been outmaneuvered, outplayed, and publicly neutralized. The internal affairs interview room was the color of beige despair. The walls were bare, the air was stale, and the only furniture was a metal table and 3 chairs bolted to the floor. It was a room designed to make people feel small and isolated, a place where careers came to die. Officer Davis sat hunched over the table, his large hands clasped together, his face a thunderous mask of resentment. He felt like a cornered animal. "I'm telling you," he said for the 3rd time, his voice a low growl, "I followed protocol. We received a call about a loiterer, a suspicious person. We responded. The suspect was non-compliant and refused a lawful order to vacate the park." The 2 IA investigators, a man and a woman with tired, impassive faces, just looked at him. She claimed she identified herself as the park's commissioner, Officer Davis. The woman said, her voice flat. She mumbled something. Davis shot back defensively. "People say all kinds of things when they're getting arrested. I'm supposed to believe every story I hear?" She resisted. "I made a judgment call based on 30 years of experience. Now I'm being thrown to the wolves because she turned out to be some big shot. This whole thing is a political circus, and I'm the clown they're putting in the dunk tank." He saw himself as the victim, a scapegoat for a city that had gone soft, a city that no longer respected the difficult, dangerous work he did. There was no introspection, no glimmer of doubt, only the hard, bitter certainty that he was the one being wronged. An hour later, Officer Wright sat in the same chair, but his posture was the complete opposite of his partner's. He sat upright, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the metal table, as if it held the answers to questions he had never thought to ask. He looked younger than his 30 years, and deeply, profoundly weary. "We were wrong," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the silent room. "I was wrong." The investigators exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. "Explain that, Officer Wright," the man said, his tone softening slightly. Wright took a deep breath. "The call was for a loiterer. We got there, and I saw a woman sitting on a bench, drawing in a book. She was well dressed. She wasn't bothering anyone. There was no reason, no objective reason, to see her as a threat." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a troubled, searching honesty. "When she said she was the commissioner, I didn't believe her, and I have to ask myself why. The truth is," he paused, the confession costing him something, "I don't have a good answer. I just saw what I expected to see, what my partner expected to see, a black woman in a rundown park, and we made an assumption. He escalated the situation, and I didn't do anything to stop it. I just followed his lead. That's on me." He had spent the last 24 hours replaying the incident in his mind, the woman's calm dignity, Davis's instant aggression, the sick feeling in his own stomach as he helped put the cuffs on her. For the first time in his career, he was seeing a call not from behind the badge, but from the other side, and the view was deeply unsettling. A chasm had opened up between him and his partner, a fundamental difference in perspective that he knew, with a sinking feeling, could never be bridged. The city council budget meeting was held in a grand, wood-paneled chamber that always felt cold, no matter the season. The air was thick with the self-importance of minor political figures. Chanel sat in the front row of the public gallery, with Maria beside her, as Councilman Roberts took the floor. He was in his element now, his voice smooth and reasonable, his words carefully chosen to sound like fiscal prudence rather than political assassination. "Distinguished colleagues," he began, "in light of the recent and unfortunate controversy surrounding Redwood Park, I believe it is our fiduciary duty to act with caution." He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing the entire city in his concern. "Therefore, I raise a motion to temporarily re-evaluate the previously allocated funding for the proposed youth center. Perhaps it is prudent to pause and ensure we are allocating taxpayer money responsibly, rather than rushing into a multi-million-dollar project fueled by emotional reactions." He was clever. Chanel had to give him that. He had framed his opposition as a sensible, level-headed response to a volatile situation. He was counting on the other council members to see it as a safe harbor, a way to avoid taking a side in the public feud. When the council president asked for any public comment on the motion, Chanel stood. All eyes turned to her. "Councilman Roberts is right," she began, her voice calm and respectful, causing a ripple of surprise in the room. Roberts himself looked momentarily pleased. "It is prudent to be responsible with taxpayer money, and it is wise to avoid making decisions based on emotional reactions." She walked to the public lectern. "But let's be clear about the emotions we are discussing. Are we talking about my understandable anger at being unjustly arrested? Or are we talking about the daily, grinding emotion of the city's youth, the hopelessness they feel when they see another community center closed, another after-school program cut?" She turned her attention from Roberts to the other council members, making eye contact with each of them. "The only emotional reaction I see here is the city's youth crying out for a safe place to go, a place to learn, a place to grow. The funding for this center was approved 6 months ago, after years of studies, community input, and careful financial planning. The only thing that has changed between then and now is that the entire city has been given a painful, public reminder of exactly why this center is so desperately necessary." Her voice dropped, becoming more personal, more direct. "My arrest was a symptom of a community that is divided. This center is the cure. It is the most responsible, most prudent, and most necessary investment we can possibly make. To delay it now, to hide behind procedural excuses, would not be fiscal responsibility. It would be a moral failure." She finished and returned to her seat. The silence in the chamber was absolute. She had not only defended her project, she had made supporting it a moral imperative. To vote with Roberts now would be to publicly align against the city's children, against progress, against the woman who had become an overnight symbol of grace under pressure. One by one, the council members spoke, each voicing their renewed and unequivocal support for the Redwood Park Youth Center. When the vote was called on Roberts' motion, it died without a single supporter, not even a second. The project was not only safe, it was officially greenlit to proceed at the accelerated pace Chanel had announced. Roberts sat down, his face a stony mask, but his eyes burned with the fury of a public and very personal defeat. The first battle was over. Chanel had won, The groundbreaking ceremony was not a grand affair of politicians in stiff suits, but a small, hopeful gathering that felt more like a family picnic, a stark and beautiful contrast to the ugliness that had transpired on the very same soil. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of change. A single golden shovel, polished to a mirror shine, was stuck into a patch of freshly turned earth, catching the afternoon sun like a beacon. Chanel stood beside it, not in a power suit, but in comfortable jeans and a warm cream-colored sweater, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail. She was surrounded by the true stakeholders of this project, the community members whose children would soon fill the halls of the new center. Excited kids, their faces bright with an almost unbearable anticipation, wiggled impatiently in the small crowd, their parents looking on with expressions of cautious optimism, a look Chanel knew with an intimate familiarity. It was the look of people who had been promised things before, who had seen dreams deferred and budgets cut, but who desperately wanted to believe that this time, finally, would be different. An elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who had lived across the street from the park for 50 years, clutched a tissue in her hand, her eyes already glistening. She remembered the park in its heyday and had watched its slow, painful decline. Seeing Chanel, a woman who looked like her own granddaughters, standing there with such fierce determination, felt like witnessing the turning of a long, slow tide. The sounds of the city, the distant traffic and sirens, seemed to fade into a respectful hush as Chanel began to speak. Her voice, amplified by a small, portable speaker, was warm and full of genuine emotion, not the calculated cadence of a politician seeking votes. "We are not just breaking ground today," she said, her gaze sweeping over the faces before her, lingering on Mrs. Gable, on the eager children, on the tired but hopeful parents. "We are planting a seed of hope, of safety, of opportunity. This building will not be made of just steel and glass. It will be built with the love and the strength of this community. This is your center." She then did something that wasn't in any official program. She scanned the crowd of children and her eyes landed on a small, shy girl of about 10, hiding behind her mother's coat. "What's your name, sweetie?" Chanel asked gently. The girl whispered, "Jasmine." Chanel smiled. "Jasmine, would you come help me? This is for you, after all." Hesitantly, Jasmine came forward, and Chanel invited her to place her small hands on the golden shovel. Together, their hands covering one another's on the smooth wooden handle, they pushed the shovel into the earth and lifted the first scoop. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of joyous, heartfelt sound that was the park's true reconsecration. The moment the ceremony ended, the work began in earnest. The sounds of progress, loud, chaotic, and wonderfully disruptive, replaced the park's former oppressive silence. The mournful creak of the rusted playground, a sound that had defined the park's decay for a generation, was silenced forever by the deafening roar of a bulldozer, its heavy metal teeth tearing down the melancholy skeleton of neglect. The rhythmic clang of hammers on steel beams, the high-pitched whine of circular saws cutting through fresh, fragrant lumber, the insistent, high-pitched beeping of reversing trucks. It was a symphony of construction, a powerful anthem of renewal that echoed through the neighborhood. A montage of progress unfolded over the following weeks, a time-lapse of creation visible to everyone. Foundations were poured, a complex grid of concrete and rebar that spoke of permanence. A skeleton of steel rose against the sky, stark and geometric, and soon walls began to give the structure a tangible shape, a body for its emerging soul. It was more than just a building. It was a promise taking form, right before their eyes. And the community, true to Chanel's word, took ownership. Local youth, teenagers who had once used the park's decaying benches as a place for sullen loitering, were drawn in by the sheer energy of the transformation. Soon, they were volunteering on weekends, not with heavy machinery, but with tasks that made the center theirs. Under the guidance of a local muralist, they began painting vibrant, sprawling artworks on the temporary construction barriers, transforming the ugly plywood into a public gallery of community pride, depicting scenes of unity, history, and aspiration. Families came to plant gardens around the perimeter of the site, their hands digging into the same earth where Chanel had been arrested, now reclaiming it for a brighter purpose, planting flowers and vegetables that would grow alongside the building. They were not just building a youth center, they were actively rebuilding their park, their neighborhood, and their faith in the future, one brushstroke, one flower bulb at a time. As part of their official disciplinary action, a consequence Captain Wallace had shrewdly framed as enhanced community engagement, officers Davis and Wright were reassigned. Their punishment was a walking patrol, a beat that took them directly through the heart of the neighborhood surrounding the rapidly developing Redwood Park. Every day, twice a day, they had to walk past the construction site, a constant, unavoidable reminder of their monumental error in judgment. For Officer Davis, each step was an exercise in simmering resentment. He was sullen, his face set in a permanent scowl that deepened every time he rounded the corner and saw the project. He saw the rising structure not as a beacon of hope, but as a monument to his personal humiliation. The sounds of construction grated on his nerves, each hammer blow a fresh insult, each cheer from a volunteer a mocking laugh at his expense. He made a point to look away as they passed, his gaze fixed on the opposite side of the street, his jaw tight with a bitterness that was eating him alive. "Look at that circus." He'd grumble to write, his voice a low growl. All this for some woman who can't follow a simple order, wasting taxpayer money on a palace for delinquents. In his mind, this center was being built on the ashes of his reputation, a gaudy trophy celebrating his downfall, and he hated it with a passion that was both corrosive and deeply sad. Officer Wright, however, walked the same beat, but saw a completely different world. He was contemplative, the daily patrol becoming a kind of penance, an education he hadn't known he needed. He watched the construction with a quiet, growing sense of awe. He saw the excitement in the children's faces as they peered through the chain link fence, their chatter full of dreams about the basketball court and the computer lab. He saw the pride in the eyes of the parents who volunteered on weekends, their faces glowing with sweat and accomplishment. He started to understand, in a visceral, undeniable way, what Chanel had been talking about that day. This wasn't just a building, it was the heart of the community being brought back to life, and he had almost helped to stop it. His own prejudices, the ones he had confessed to in the stark IA interview room, began to feel not just wrong, but profoundly foolish. The lazy conclusions of a man who had stopped looking. He started to engage, tentatively at first. He would offer a quiet good morning to the construction foreman, who eventually responded with a gruff nod. He learned the names of the kids who always hung around the site, like Jasmine, who now proudly pointed out the section of the mural she had painted. One afternoon he saw Maria, Chanel's firecracker assistant, reviewing a set of blueprints with a contractor. He hesitated, a familiar knot of awkwardness tightening in his stomach, but he forced himself to approach. "It's, coming along fast," he said, his voice feeling clumsy and loud. Maria looked up, her eyes instantly wary, her posture stiffening as she recognized the uniform. "We have a lot of support," she replied, her tone polite but clipped, a clear defensive shield around her. Wright nodded, not taking offense. He deserved her suspicion. "I can see that," he said, his sincerity cutting through her reserve. He gestured toward the vibrant murals, a riot of color and life. "It's good to see. It's really good to see." He then tipped his hat, a gesture that felt both old, fashioned, and deeply respectful, and continued on his patrol, leaving Maria staring after him, a flicker of surprise on her face. It was a small moment, a brief, awkward conversation, but for Wright, it was a step. He was no longer just seeing what he expected to see, he was finally starting to see what was actually there. The first major crisis struck on a Tuesday, a day that had started with clear skies and the optimistic roar of machinery. Construction, which had been moving at a breakneck pace, ground to a sudden, jarring halt. The problem was a vital shipment of custom-made, triple-paned windows, the very glass walls Chanel had sketched to flood the center with light and life. They were sitting in a warehouse across the state, tangled in a web of red tape. A sudden, inexplicable permitting issue had been filed with the city's zoning department, flagging the shipment for a mandatory review that could take weeks, if not months. The delay was a dagger aimed at the heart of the project's accelerated timeline and, more importantly, at the community's fragile, burgeoning hope. Frustration rippled through the worksite. The optimistic energy that had been so palpable was replaced by a tense, worried quiet. The symphony of construction fell silent. Maria, tasked by Chanel to solve the problem, attacked it with the ferocity of a mother bear defending her cub. She was a whirlwind of focused energy, her loyalty to Chanel and her belief in the project fueling her every move. She spent 2 full days on the phone, navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the city government, being transferred from one indifferent clerk to another in a maddening loop of hold music and polite deflections. Everyone was polite, but no one could explain the origin of the complaint that had triggered the hold. It was anonymous, they said, a digital ghost in the machine. But Maria was not a detective. She was something far more formidable, a determined millennial who had grown up online. She knew that nothing digital was ever truly a ghost. Working late into the night from her own apartment, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her determined face, fueled by coffee and outrage. She started digging. She referenced permit numbers with shipping manifests, tracked down routing codes, and finally, she focused on the anonymous digital complaint itself. She traced its digital footprint, following the trail of servers and routers from the state database back to the city's network. She hit a wall, an IP address firewalled behind the city's own secure network. It seemed like a dead end, but Maria had a friend who worked in the city's IT department, a tech geek she'd bonded with over a shared love for old science fiction movies. A quick, hushed phone call and a promise of 2 tickets to the upcoming comic convention was all it took. Her friend, intrigued by the challenge, ran the IP address. The result came back in a text message that made Maria's blood run cold, then hot with incandescent fury. The complaint had been filed from a desktop computer in the office of Councilman Roberts's chief of staff. It was the smoking gun. "We've got him," Maria said, her voice a low, trembling mixture of triumph and rage. She had burst into Chanel's temporary office at the construction site the next morning, slapping a printout of her findings onto the makeshift desk. "He's a snake, and we've got him dead to rights. We leaked this to the press, and his career is over by lunchtime. We can burn him to the ground." Her eyes shone with a righteous, vengeful fire. She wanted retribution, a public crucifixion for the man who had tried to sabotage their dream. Chanel looked at the paper, her expression calm and unreadable. She saw the same evidence Maria did, the clear line from Roberts's office to their current crisis, but she saw a different path forward. A public expose would be satisfying, a quick, brutal victory. But it would also mire the youth center in another political scandal, another round of mudslinging that would distract from its true purpose. Roberts wanted a dirty fight in the shadows, and a public brawl would just be a bigger version of the same game. Chanel had a different strategy in mind, one that was quieter, sharper, and far more effective. She looked up from the paper, her eyes meeting Maria's. "He wants to play dirty in the shadows," she said, her voice quiet and firm. "So we're going to turn on the lights." She tapped the printout. "But we're going to do it in his office, not on the 6 o'clock news. A public fight gives him a platform, a chance to play the victim, a private one." A slow, strategic smile touched her lips, a smile that was all steel. "Gives us leverage." She picked up her phone. "Maria, schedule a meeting with Councilman Roberts for this afternoon. Tell his assistant it's about the future of the Redwood Park project. And tell her I'll be bringing my lawyer." Councilman Roberts's office was a shrine to his own ambition, a cold, minimalist space of glass and chrome that offered a commanding view of the city he intended to conquer. He sat behind his vast, empty desk, a portrait of smug condescension, his hands steepled before him. He had agreed to this meeting out of a sense of political theater, assuming Chanel had come to beg or bargain. He was prepared to enjoy her desperation. Chanel sat opposite him, a picture of serene composure, her lawyer a silent, imposing figure beside her. She did not look desperate. She looked like a queen who had just cornered a king. "Thank you for seeing us, Councilman," Chanel began, her voice as cool and polished as the glass table between them. Roberts gave a magnanimous wave of his hand. "Of course, Commissioner. I'm always willing to discuss the responsible use of city funds. I assume you've come to see the wisdom in my proposal to pause the Redwood project." Chanel didn't answer his question. Instead, she slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "I believe this belongs to you," she said. Roberts glanced down at it, his smug expression faltering as he recognized the printout of the IP trace, the digital breadcrumbs leading directly from the anonymous zoning complaint to the computer in his chief of staff's office. The color drained from his face, his carefully constructed composure shattered like cheap glass, replaced by the raw, panicked look of a man caught in a trap of his own making. He looked from the paper to Chanel, his mouth opening and closing silently. "You will personally resolve this permitting issue by the end of the day," Chanel stated, her voice not rising, but cutting through the silence with the precision of a surgeon's blade. It was not a request, it was a directive. "The windows will be on a truck and heading to Redwood Park by morning, and you will be at the ribbon-cutting ceremony next month. You will stand on that stage, and you will smile for the cameras, and you will give a speech about what a wonderful, unifying project this is for our city." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his, her quiet intensity more intimidating than any shout. "Because this center, Councilman, is more important than our petty politics. It's more important than your career, and it's certainly more important than my anger." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle on him. "And if you, or anyone in your office, ever interferes with it, or any other community project I oversee, ever again, This evidence, along with a much more detailed file, will find its way to every reporter in this city before you can even draft a press release. Am I understood? Roberts, pale and sweating, could only manage a single jerky nod. He had come expecting a fight, but Chanel had refused to engage on his terms. She hadn't come to destroy him, she had come to recruit him by force. It was a political checkmate, a victory achieved not through destruction, but through strategic leverage for the greater good, and it left him utterly, completely defeated. The grand opening of the Brooks Community Youth Center was a day of pure, unadulterated joy. The building itself was a masterpiece of light and hope, the physical embodiment of Chanel's sketchbook dreams. The glass walls she had envisioned soared 2 stories high, flooding the interior with golden afternoon light and erasing the line between the park and the center, making them one continuous, welcoming space. The revitalized park that surrounded it was lush and green, the laughter of children echoing from a brand new, brightly colored playground. A massive, diverse crowd had gathered on the new lawn, a vibrant tapestry of the community in all its forms. Parents held children on their shoulders. Teenagers who had painted the murals now stood with their families, pointing out their work with pride, and elderly residents who had watched the park's decline now watched its rebirth with tears in their eyes. From the edge of the crowd, Agnes Petrov, the woman who had made the fateful call, watched the proceedings with a complex, unreadable expression. She had come out of a grudging curiosity, and what she saw was not the den of delinquents she had feared, but a joyous, thriving hub of community life that made her own quiet, sterile apartment feel like a prison. On the temporary stage erected in front of the entrance, Councilman Roberts stood stiffly, a fixed, uncomfortable smile plastered on his face, looking like a man at his own execution. He was trapped, forced to publicly endorse the very project he had tried to kill, a living testament to Chanel's quiet, unyielding power. When Chanel's name was announced, the ovation was thunderous, a wave of love and gratitude that washed over her as she walked to the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the beautiful building behind her, at the children whose futures it represented, and her heart swelled with an emotion so powerful it almost took her breath away. "Look at what we have built together," she began, her voice thick with emotion but ringing with strength. "Not just a building of glass and steel, but a foundation of hope. Not just a center, but a community." She paused, her gaze finding the exact spot, now covered in lush green grass, where the cold steel of the handcuffs had bitten into her wrists. "A few weeks ago, on this very spot, I was made to feel like I didn't belong. I was treated like a threat in the very park I am sworn to protect. Today, with the opening of these doors, we are making a new declaration. We are declaring that everyone belongs, everyone is safe, everyone is welcome." She let her eyes roam the crowd, seeing the nodding heads, the tear-streaked faces, the hope she had helped to ignite. "Change is not easy," she continued, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "It requires us to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our city. It requires forgiveness, which is often the hardest work of all. And it requires the courage to build bridges, even to those who have wronged us, because a community divided against itself cannot stand." She took a deep breath, preparing for the moment that would define the day, the final, most difficult step in her strategy of radical reconciliation. "In that spirit of building bridges, I want to invite 2 very special guests to join me in cutting this ribbon. Officers Davis and Wright, would you please come up here?" A shocked, profound silence fell over the crowd. The joyous applause died in an instant, replaced by a collective gasp. 1,000 heads turned in unison, a wave of disbelief rippling through the audience as they searched for the 2 officers. The news cameras, which had been focused on Chanel, whipped around, their lenses zooming in on the edge of the crowd where the 2 uniformed officers stood, assigned to the event as part of their ongoing community patrol. They were suddenly, brutally, in the spotlight. Officer Davis froze, his body going rigid as if he'd been struck by lightning. His face was a chaotic war of emotions, pride warring with a deep, burning shame, shock battling with a flicker of something that looked almost like gratitude. He was trapped, pinned by 1,000 pairs of eyes, and he couldn't move. He was a man drowning in the consequences of his own actions, and Chanel had just thrown him a lifeline he was too proud, too broken, to grab. Officer Wright, however, was different. He looked at his partner's frozen form, at the hard, resentful lines of his face, and he saw the dead end of a long, bitter road. Then he looked at Chanel, standing on the stage, her hand outstretched, not in accusation, but in invitation. He saw a different path. He took a single, deep, shuddering breath, a breath that let go of a lifetime of assumptions, of deference, of just following orders. And then he began to walk. He walked away from his partner, away from the man he had been. He walked past the news cameras that had captured his worst moment, his head held high. He walked through the stunned, parting crowd, their faces a blur of confusion and dawning understanding. He walked up the steps to the stage, each step feeling heavier and lighter than the last. He stopped in front of Chanel, his eyes meeting hers, and in their depths he saw not a victim, but a leader. "Commissioner," he said, his voice quiet and thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "What you've done here, thank you." Chanel's warm smile reached her eyes. She handed him a pair of oversized golden scissors. "We did it together, officer," she replied softly. She then called Jasmine and 2 other children from the crowd to join them. Together, the park's commissioner, the police officer whose perspective she had irrevocably changed, and the children of the community, they held the scissors and cut the wide blue ribbon. For a beat, there was silence, and then the crowd erupted. The applause was not just polite, it was a roar, a cathartic, explosive release of emotion, a sound of forgiveness and new beginnings. From the back of the crowd, Officer Davis watched, his hard, cynical exterior finally cracking under the weight of the moment. He turned away, unable to watch any longer, but as he did, a single, hot tear escaped and rolled down his weathered cheek. The final montage was a symphony of life. The Brooks Community Youth Center was in full swing, a vibrant, humming hive of activity. Kids who had once had nowhere to go now filled its halls with energy and laughter. The squeak of sneakers on the polished basketball court, the quiet hum of concentration in the computer lab where kids were learning to code, the murmur of voices in the library where older teens helped younger ones with their homework. It was the sound of a promise fulfilled. And Officer Wright was a regular visitor. He wasn't there in his uniform, not as a cop, but as a volunteer. He coached the junior basketball team, his easy smile and patient guidance making him a favorite among the kids. One afternoon, as he was leaving, he saw Chanel watching from the doorway. He gave her a nod, a simple gesture of mutual respect and shared understanding that spoke volumes. A bridge had been built. A few weeks later, the last golden light of a perfect autumn afternoon was filtering through the trees of Redwood Park. Chanel was sitting on a bench, the same bench, her sketchbook open in her lap. She wasn't drawing a building this time, but a garden, a new community project to grow fresh produce for local families. The park was alive around her, peaceful and thriving. She heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to see Officer Davis on his patrol. He was walking alone now. He saw her, and for a moment he hesitated, his internal conflict visible in his posture. Then he changed his course and stopped a few feet from her bench. "Commissioner," he said, his voice still gruff, his eyes not quite meeting hers, instead fixed on the thriving youth center that stood as a testament to her vision. Chanel looked up from her sketchbook and offered him a small, warm smile. "Officer," she replied, her tone gentle, without a hint of triumph. He nodded toward the building, a muscle working in his jaw. "It's good work," he managed to say, the words feeling heavy and unfamiliar in his mouth. It was as close to an apology, to an admission, as a man like him could ever get. "The work is never done, officer," Chanel said softly, "but it's a start." Davis stood there for a moment longer, then gave a single, sharp nod, a flicker of something that might have been a smile touching his lips before it vanished. He turned and continued his patrol, but his step seemed lighter, his shoulders a little less slumped. Chanel watched him go, then looked back down at her sketchbook, at the blank pages waiting to be filled with new dreams. A quiet, determined smile graced her face. The city was still imperfect, the scars were still there, but a bridge had been built, and she was ready for the next challenge.